So hello everyone and welcome to NIBA. We're going to be, my name by the way is Andrea Cataneo. I know most of you, but there are some new faces always. It's wonderful to see people that I haven't seen in a long time. When we were speaking as a board, we were discussing some of the topics that we thought might be of interest to the presenting companies. And it is quite unfathomable how much blockchain and cryptocurrency conversation is going on all around us. And when it was brought up on a call, the first person that I thought of was Yoel Goldfeder, who will get up in a moment and introduce himself. Yoel and I worked together for years, many years ago, and he now is CEO and runs VStock Transfer. I was about to say vintage, but VStock Transfer. And quite knowledgeable about this space. So without further ado, I'm going to give kind of just a little overview and talk about some things as if many of you don't have a whole lot of familiarity with blockchain and with cryptocurrencies, just really by means of an overview. Yoel is we're just gonna do a stream of consciousness back and forth, happy to answer questions. And I've had the good fortune recently of attending the Crypto Invest Summit, and I'll conclude with some of the highlights from that conference. There were 5,000 people that were present. It was shocking how much this business has really developed internationally. So just a few things to not bore you terribly. If you haven't heard of an ICO or an initial coin offering, in 2017 they were kind of taking the world by storm. And unfortunately, some of the players in the space were not the most legitimate, but a research report, and I got this from Autonomous Research, and I've heard many other statistics, I tend to trust this organization, they indicated that $7+ billion was raised in ICOs in 2017. And we'll talk a little bit more about what an ICO is, and so will Yoel, but that's kind of shocking. Year to date in 2018, $12 billion has been raised. And that's, that's a big number. It's nowhere near what might be being raised in other securities, but it's certainly a large number. The nosedive by September of pretty much a 90% nosedive since January of 2018 until September. We as securities lawyers believe it's attributable largely to a lot of regulatory uncertainty and just seeing so many of these companies that have entered into these raises getting into a lot of trouble by not following securities laws. Basically, we're hearing that 20% of the ICOs were plagiarized and lots of other statistics that are not all that comforting. But it's not all bad. I mean, there are a lot of positives here, and I'm just going to go through basics on what blockchain technology is and what a token is, and then I'm going to turn this over to Yoel, who speaks about this all the time. And the reason I asked to speak first is he's probably going to say everything I was going to say, and then I wouldn't be able to speak with all of you. So I thought I would hog up the first position and at least give you a little bit of an overview. By the way, is anyone in here familiar with an ICO? Have any of you invested in ICOs? Have you picked up a digital wallet? Do you have cryptocurrencies that you trade? By show of hands, anyone? Okay. Okay, so I would say 2% or so. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that quick math. I appreciate it. Block geek. So what is blockchain technology? It's a type of distributed ledger for maintaining a permanent or tamper-proof record of transactional data. It's like a decentralized database. I often think of it as when you're doing a title search on your house and you pay, a law firm or a title search company to go through all of those records. Imagine if you had it all foolproof, decentralized, with all of the information that you need without any middle people involved. And you could just look at that chain of information and see that chain of title, knowing full well that at every step it was completely secure. I've oversimplified it, but on so many levels, the technology that was kind of introduced by Bitcoin, the real nugget here of quality is in the blockchain. It's going to probably transform banking, stock transfer agents, a little for the better, and you're gonna talk about how you're gonna make it amazing But a lot of service providers are going to have different roles as a result, we all believe. So it's important that we're talking about this because things are going to be changing and we should really know about it. So what's a token? A token can fulfill either one or several of the following functions. We talk about cryptocurrencies. It could be a currency. I have a picture here of, remember those old New York tokens? Anybody here remember them? Yeah. So yeah, I still have one, I think. It could be a digital asset. It could be a means of accounting. It could be a share of common stock, which, you know, I'm so familiar with. It could be a reward, payments, internal currency, et cetera. Lots of different things. And the confusing part about what is a token makes it additionally confusing to the regulators when they're trying to determine whether or not a token is a security. Is it something that you're playing a game with? Is it a digital coupon? Is it a frequent flyer mile? Those all sound like utilities. That doesn't sound like a currency, right? But there's a test that's sort of applied called the Howey test, and I mentioned it in the presentation. Most of us looking at tokens are familiar with this case from 1946, which actually had to do with two guys that owned an orange grove, and they were doing a sale lease back, and the SEC ultimately determined that they were dealing with securities by applying a test asking, hey, does this transaction involve the investment of money? And is there a possibility that there's a common enterprise and that there's a third-party promoter and there could be, because of management, there could be an increase in value? That's a security, right? So anyway, if a token's a security, securities laws apply. And that's where securities lawyers come in. I'm going to let Yoel take the floor if you want to talk a little bit more about utility tokens. And he's got, as I said, lots of insight. So please welcome Yoel Goldfeder.
So I apologize. I didn't actually prepare any notes. I literally talk about tokens. You know, it's the wave of the future that everybody wants to happen right now. So I literally talk about tokens and token offerings on at least, 4 times a week. I'm on a conference call with other service providers, people in the securities industry. Tokens were an underground thing. I mean, people knew what Bitcoin was, maybe looked at Ethereum. I had a friend who was involved in Ripple, and these were all cryptocurrencies. What really brought it to the forefront is, and I'll talk about last summer when the SEC put out their DAO report, where the SEC looked at the DAO project, the DAO, and determined that these tokens are securities. The SEC makes a distinction between cryptocurrency and tokens. They don't really clarify what that distinction is, what makes it a currency, but it doesn't make a difference because if it's a currency, then you have to deal with the banking authorities instead of the SEC. So either way, you're dealing with some regulatory body, which everybody is fighting over who's going to control. So it's kind of become accepted since last summer, especially since last December. The SEC sent out a slew of subpoenas to, I think, about 100 people in the industry. And since then, everybody says, okay, we're no longer going to do ICOs. We're no longer going to do initial coin offerings. Now the vernacular is we're all going to do STOs, security token offerings, because now we've recognized it's security. And I can't tell you how many people advertise and tell me that they're offering token services, but they're offering compliant token services. I go, great, you're compliant token services. That's wonderful, I'm a transfer agent. They go, well, why do I need a transfer agent? The essence of blockchain is that it's a distributed ledger that everybody can verify all the information. If anybody in the world can verify the information, it's referred to as an immutable record. Why do I need a transfer agent? So my simple, smart-ass remark is, thankfully, it's required by the SEC. And if you're waiting for the SEC to change the regulations, good luck. There was a proposal about 5 years ago to modify the transfer agent regulations because they're really outdated. They passed the regulations where people were keeping records on paper. We've moved on from there a little bit. We're not necessarily up to blockchain. So, the SEC's been sitting on that for about 5 or 6 years now. So if you're waiting for them to update the records on blockchain and recognizing that, it's going to be a while. So I apologize. I didn't get a chance to see this before.
I'm just going to mention one thing right along those lines. the SEC, in their attempt to appear that they're sort of embracing this new world, there's a whole page, it's sec.gov/ICO. And you can take a look at how the SEC feels, how they're defining things, what they're looking at. If you look at the whole right column, and you're going to see a lot of enforcement actions, which is really what they've spent most of their time really doing, like knocking down the bad apples. But that's how I think we're ultimately going to shift to a place where we know what to do, we know how to advise clients, because we know what the SEC doesn't like.
So here's where I'm going to actually disagree with something in there, and I'm happy to discuss it. You know, in the handout Andrea gave out, it talks about the SEC ambivalence. I wouldn't necessarily quantify it as ambivalence. I think the SEC is always scared. And they're always, I mean, listen, for those of you who are in the securities industry who are looking to raise capital over the years, you've heard of Reg A, you've heard of crowdfunding. You know, it was Obama that passed the Jobs Act, and it took about 2.5 years for the SEC to actually pass the regulations enabling utilization of the Jobs Act. And I don't think it was ambivalence. I think they're very cautious. And they're always worried about how this technology is going to be used to harm the investors. I mean, listen, everybody wants to talk about Reg A, crowdfunding. They've opened up the securities markets to middle-class investors, which is great because it now gives middle-class investors the opportunity to invest in companies that are growing, but there are risks, and they do want to make sure that the risks are addressed. Till now, nobody's cared about securities law, which is why they've been busy with enforcement. You know, and that's how all of a sudden everybody's, okay, this is real. I can actually have the SEC knock on my door, and if you've ever had that, it's not that much fun. You know, and now they've all of a sudden taken seriously. But what's fascinating to me, and I'm sure Andrea's seen it also, I go to a lot of these conferences, I talk to a lot of people about blockchain, and all these service providers who have no background in the securities industry, but they're technologists, they're all saying they're doing compliant tokens, they don't necessarily know what that means. They all tell me the stories how they've been to the SEC and discussed it, or they, you know, I had one service provider who says, I've been to the SEC 6 times and we had meetings. I go, great. I know the securities law. I don't have to go to the SEC. I know, you know, the services that are compliant under traditional securities law, and the traditional securities laws have not changed. The technology has changed. The ability to go out and address a new market, a younger market who's more sophisticated, who gets blockchain, who gets this, and is willing to invest in this, you now have a tool to be able to go out to those investors. But the securities laws haven't changed. So all these people who, you know, tell me that they've went to the SEC, I said, that's great. It's been a while since I've been in DC. I hear they have a nice new building. I have no reason to visit them. But the funny thing is, I was actually at a conference this summer, and there was somebody from the SEC, and they love, you know, and they say, and they were talking about the transfer agents and the businesses that they're going to, transfer agents get audited, are subject to audit. It's actually funny. The first time we were audited, I was sitting at my desk. Somebody came to me, said, oh, the SEC's here. I said, all right, transfer the phone call. They go, no, they're here. 2 examiners showed up in my office. They said, where can we sit? And I had to throw an employee out, sit here. And they said, all right, start bringing us paper. That's how we get oversight by the SEC. So, you know, when they were explaining who they were going to look to audit this year, they said, well, we're going to start auditing transfer agents that have been busy in crowdfunding and Reg A. I go, oh, you're going to come to me? I said, you don't have to audit me. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. They go, haha, no, we're going to audit you. I go, we've also been named in 2 SEC filings as a token agent for token offerings on the blockchain. And the examiner turned to me and says, okay, we're definitely going to have to talk. You know, what I'm doing, I know what the law is. I know what we're capable of. I've written about blockchain. I'm writing some more, you know, pending time. But it's merely just an extension of the traditional securities laws, just utilizing this a different medium. You know, instead of paper stock certificates, we're now issuing a digital currency. But let's be honest, you know, 90% of the public companies out there no longer issue paper certificates. You know, we have clients all the time that says, you know, well, do I need a paper certificate? We say no. And, you know, it used to be back in the day, people would spend thousands of dollars on these fancy stock certificates. Matter of fact, the most famous stock certificate, you know, you might not have never thought about it, but in securities it's a famous certificate. Everybody would buy their children stock in Disney. Why? Because every stock certificate had all the Disney characters. It happens to be 2-3 years ago, Disney says they're no longer issuing stock certificates. However, if you go to your website, you can buy a souvenir stock certificate. They'll still take the money for that. But they're no longer issuing stock certificates to their investors because it really doesn't serve that much purpose. And it's not because of blockchain, it's because of the technology we already have. Blockchain is just a distributed ledger moving away from a centralized ledger. But at the end of the day, the way the SEC stands now, they still want the trusted advisor. You know, they still like to see that central authority, that somebody, you know, that there's an adult watching the playground, you know, to make sure that everybody's following the rules. And also the SEC likes to be able to point the finger if something goes wrong, you know, because, you know, for those who've gone to the SEC, and what's fascinating is the SEC put out a press release 2 weeks ago that says that now they've opened up and they're willing to examine, you know, your product and give advice and give guidance, which is a major shift for the SEC. The SEC for years, since inception, would tell you, we don't give guidance. You know, even if you ask for a no action letter, it was, this is a no action letter for this specific fact pattern, no other fact pattern. The fact that the SEC is now willing to give guidance is, in my mind, a very, very major shift in their thought process. I actually believe that they're embracing it.
Yeah.
They're just trying to figure out how to embrace it.
So one thing I want to mention that's pretty cool. I sit on the blockchain and crypto team at my firm. I'm with Sheppard, Mullin, we're an AMRA 100 firm, and we're 92 years old. So the fact that for the past 5 years we've had a blockchain and crypto team is kind of sort of sounding cutting edge, but most of the lawyers were technology lawyers, and this group of securities lawyers in my firm that are now focused on this and learning about it meet up with the technology people regularly and discuss issues, and we had an interesting call today. One of the things that we know that the SEC is going to have an issue with, and I thought I came up with a great invention, I was going to patent it and make lots of money, but someone beat me to it, was a smart enough blockchain that recorded when an insider repossessed shares. Like imagine shares are with the CEO, and then the CEO files his Rule 16b, his Form 4, sells shares to, you know, someone in the public, and 90 days go by, and someone now has shares that they could resell. They've now someone else wants to ultimately 3 generations later sell their shares back to someone who sits on the board of directors. If there's no flag in the blockchain, if there's no indication, no one is going to know that happened, and insider information and sales that are made as a result of material non-public information is something that the SEC and FINRA cares a great deal about. So if we were able to go to the regulators and say, look, that's not going to happen because this blockchain has it all built in, and there's going to be a flag right away when this gets back in the hands of someone who has knowledge about the company, so you need not worry. And at the event just last week, I'm trying to look at what this guy talked to this compliance-aware token. He is a compliance-aware token that is a specific name, and it has, this is secure
currency. It's hard to pronounce.
Yeah. So, but they're not the only one, and thank goodness they're thinking along these lines, because that's the way we're going to satisfy the regulators. I think that's the way we're going to make them feel a little more comfortable that this won't be a runaway train that is unmanageable. You know,
the reality, though, ICOs, you know, token offerings have been around a couple of years. It's the regulated and the compliant token that's very much still in its infancy. And one of the problems that I don't know if you're seeing now, you know, for those of you who've invested in Bitcoin, Bitcoin is its own blockchain. You may be familiar with Ethereum. Ethereum is another blockchain. Ripple's another blockchain. So right now you have all these different chains. So there are some people that are using Ethereum for their smart contracts and tokens. There are some people that are using Hyperledger. There are some people that are using, what's the one with an S? I can't remember. No, there's different types of chains that people are using, all right? Now let's say you're doing Ethereum. Ethereum was the popular one for a while. Everybody was doing their tokens using a protocol called ERC-20. Well, ERC-20 is not compliant. So now everybody's coming up with their own compliant protocols. So I actually worked with Polymath. I advised them, I helped them in coming out with their protocol for a secured protocol, ERC 1400. And then somebody who I've been talking to for months, who's brilliant also, he put out his own protocol, ERC 1404. So now you have to figure out which chain am I going to go to. Now that I've picked out the chain, what are my protocols am I going to follow? Who's going to draft the smart contract? What's going to be built into this smart contract? Because as much as we like to say they're smart contracts, they're only as smart as we make them. You know, and you might have thought we've thought about whitelisting shareholders. We've also come up with the concept of blacklisting or graylisting shareholders for insiders and things like that. So these are all details that are, right now, the industry is very much focused on. A lot of people are running forward. You know, a lot of people have done offerings. You know, and I've said to people, I'm very nervous. You know, lots of these ICOs or even STOs were done in 2017 and the beginning of 2018 this year. My concern is what happens in a year from now when all these trading platforms open up and everybody says, well, I was issued a token, I now want to trade it. And now we have to actually go file with the SEC, and the SEC is going to go back and look, well, you raised money under Reg D, which I always like to say a way of avoiding regulation as opposed to following regulation. You raised money under Reg D. Let me check. Did you issue restricted tokens?
Did you blue sky?
Did you blue sky? Did you follow all the regulations? And all of a sudden people said, maybe not so much. And we've seen that. I mean, I've seen the comments that the SEC's come back on blockchain. You know, and one thing about the utility versus, you know, I spoke to Andrea briefly about it beforehand. You know, right now there's one registration. There was a Reg A that was pulled. I know a couple of people who filed anonymously. Right now we have to figure out how do we marry the concept of a security with the concept of a utility. I think the technology behind blockchain is fascinating. The possibilities are really unimaginable. You know, I've heard some pitches and I've heard some things that are just fascinating what you can do with it. But how do we say that it's a security and also a utility? Because it has to be both. I mean, we had one client who says that they want to issue a dividend for their common stockholders in utility tokens. I said, great. Is it a utility tokens? Oh no, for the industry it's very it's very important. I go, then why are you giving it to public shareholders? They have no need for that utility. Correct. So you know, and if I want to give it as a utility, I also have to justify how does that fit into the securities regulations to allow me to do an offering of a utility.
And I think what we're finding is that even if you clearly have a utility where it's analogous to a frequent flyer mile, it's something that's going to be used in your company's ecosystem, the SEC, at least today, is going to deem it a security. Maybe down the road there's going to be more of a distinction and there'll be some more flexibility in how the test will actually be followed in a fair manner. But what we're struggling with as attorneys trying to advise our clients is you gotta deem it a security, provide the full disclosure. It's all about investor protection. All of these laws that came about after the crash of '29, they're still in force. You know, the 33 Act, the Exchange Act was making 33. These are really all about investor protection and everything that follows. So, at least for now, we're really kind of, I guess, putting a round peg in a square hole and doing our best to make sure we're being somewhat conservative and keeping our clients out of.
Yeah, I mean, listen, at the end of the day, the SEC is still stinging from 2008 when thousands, millions of accredited investors who were sophisticated investors lost their money in various funds and things of that nature. So there's always a tough balance between and as much as the SEC always likes talking about, opening markets up and creating, opportunities for companies to raise money, there's always the back end, raise money, as long as we do it in a right way to make sure that the investors are protected. Anything else?
Definitely some things worth reading if you're interested. Some articles that I have links to that if this subject interests you, if you have anything in particular that you wanted to talk about. I know I have some clients in here that would really take great interest in pursuing a Reg A and a private subsidiary. And the unfortunate news we still have is we really don't have a few Reg As that we can refer to that made it through and had the support.
Correct.
In fact, we really can't refer to one. The few that are still probably under review that were confidentially filed, not really sure how the SEC is going to fall on that front. And we don't want to deny our clients the opportunity. However, there's not a whole lot that we have to lean on.
No, but let's be realistic. Right now,
5 or 6 B and C are working out fine.
right now, people are raising on blockchain using, Reg D offerings. It's still a viable option. But the reality is the ATS and trading platforms are still
Yes.
developing.
Yes.
Everybody asks me how many we've done. Well, no Reg A's got approved, nothing's gotten approved, but there's no market for these tokens anyway. They're out there, they're developing. It was months that, I was talking to platforms. Now I'm getting phone calls from a lot of ATSs, broker-dealers who are now building out trading platforms in order to trade these tokens. And, we've talked about Ethereum and, all these different types of platforms. And right now it's a question of which, protocols will win, which will survive, or maybe all of them. What's fascinating and the opportunities here I like are, right now for companies that want to go public, you have limited options, NASDAQ, New York Stock Exchange, or the OTC. There is the possibility for your token to trade on multiple platforms. The technology's out there. There are people who don't like the technology, like DTC. I was talking to somebody from DTC, and for those who don't know, DTC runs the backbone of all the trading markets. They don't like it, and he says, they're going to come for me. I spoke to somebody from DTC. He said they can take my gold watch off of my dead body. And they're, the investment, some of the investment bankers don't like it. Goldman Sachs, not the broker dealers. The broker dealers are embracing it and getting into it. A lot of the clearing firms and clearing agencies will probably get pushed out of the way when you're coming to blockchain, because there's more opportunity for individuals to trade directly.
I've included, and I thought I had page numbers on here, so sorry. Secondary trading of security tokens. There are definitely some companies that you can look at. They're international. There's actually SharePost you can look at.
Except SharePost announced that they got approval, which was great, except they didn't finish building the technology.
Yeah,
so that was an issue.
It's a little bit early for a lot of these, but for those of you who are exploring, all I can recommend is read, learn. There are probably 3 or 4 excellent newsletters that compile a lot of good information if you're interested. Stay on top of it and speak with your advisors about what your game plan is. And if you have something that you want to do in the near future, just make sure you have all of the current information before diving in and spending a lot of money.
Yeah, and even more so than regular raises. I mean, if you're doing a Reg D, if you're doing a private offering, raising funds, you're going to discuss it with your counsel. Even more so if you're going to dive into this area, having a competent attorney who understands this space, not me. I like my joke. I don't know if I've ever told you this joke. I've gotten so good I don't have to practice anymore. But you should definitely have a competent attorney who understands not just the technology and understands it, but understands the regulations behind it as well. Because when you start dicing into it, and getting into it, there's a lot of red flags that we see that are pitfalls to be avoided.
There's a token analysis that my firm put together to help companies determine whether or not they really need to employ blockchain or a token. Because sometimes it just sounds like such a cutting edge thing to do. It sounds like, I'm going to attract a lot of investors if I just talk about doing this, even if I'm not planning on doing it anytime soon. And this is a questionnaire that I'm happy to send to any of you if you're interested. And you could really kind of think through, is this something that my company could really benefit from? Is this technology actually going to help me achieve certain things? Can I write about it in a way that the SEC or some regulator is going to believe there's a real business based on it, so a real business case?
However, definitely don't advertise you're getting into blockchain business if you have no intent, because the SEC has been going after those companies who put blockchain in their name or their description without any connection to blockchain, and they haven't liked that because people are just jumping on top of the word just to attract investors.
Yep, yep. And that's a funny one too. It's like, it just seems counterintuitive, like, what are you looking for? Buy AC? So, any questions? It's a little early for the cocktail party, so.
You know what? I was at a conference 2 weeks ago, met an old friend of mine who I used to practice law with, and there's a lot in blockchain going on in Israel. There's a lot of lawyers in Israel, and it's actually interesting. Israel, the government is embracing blockchain a lot more so. I don't know if you, a lot more than China, who outlawed it for a while, but I think is now opening up. So I'm sure there's a lot of material in Hebrew. I don't have it.
And I'm glad you brought that up. There are several countries, I attached a link, but among the countries that have banned trading cryptocurrencies, you should know this, because not everyone is embracing it. Plenty of countries are, though, but Bolivia, Bangladesh, Nepal, Morocco, Ecuador, China, for the moment, but China might be.
But I will tell you,
miss an opportunity to,
for those who want to go to Malta, they're embracing blockchain. If I'm not mistaken, there's a blockchain conference going on right now, and I saw somebody from Malta. They're bending over backwards to be the blockchain capital of the world, at least for now, until the other countries open up.
So, aside from the request to get the books in Hebrew, anyone else have any?
Otherwise, I think we've spoken more than, I'm happy to hang around, answer any questions, but otherwise, yeah. Correct.
That's fine.
That's one way to avoid the SEC. And I see that a lot, and I say, great, you don't need me, I don't need you, go raise money. And I have a friend who's doing work out in Malta, and he says he's not coming to the United States. Although he has been talking to me, and he says, you know what, there's more broker-dealers in the United States, there's more market makers, there's more investors. I say, there's another thing that comes up. A lot of people tell me that they're artificially going to keep their number of investors less than 2,000, because that's the magic number under which you then have to report to the SEC. So they're going to program their smart contracts so they can't have more than 2,000 investors. I go, great. So you're going to go public with a token and build into it a limitation on the liquidity of your marketplace. It's kind of counterintuitive. You're cutting off your hand to spite,
Right, it takes away the anonymity.
So that is a different concept. So you're not going to get away from the oversight in the U.S. And it's fascinating. I had a conversation with the developer of ERC20. I met him at a conference. He's out of Germany. He goes, okay, now I understand the role of a transfer agent. You're there to centralize a decentralized system. I said, unfortunately, that's what we do. The SEC believes in the gatekeeper. And in order to have gatekeepers such as lawyers, transfer agents, there has to be a gate. And there's no way, and especially now that everybody has kind of acknowledged at this point that we need to have KYC AML. Once you build in KYC AML, there's no more anonymous,
That's in the uploading, that's when you first bring someone on.
and they're talking, so the problem is, if you're an ATS, you have to be a registered broker-dealer.
Yes.
Part of the requirements of a registered broker-dealer is KYC AML. So even if you're after the issuance, you're still going to have to go through whitelisting down the road for the exchanges and marketplaces. And I will tell you, Congress, in their analysis of this, has said in the past that they want more companies to have more transparency. Right now, if you're a private company, you know your shareholders. They invested in your business, they helped you out, you have maybe 50 shareholders, 100 shareholders. When you're a public company and people are buying and selling and trading in their brokerage accounts, most companies don't know who their shareholders are. And they don't really communicate necessarily with their shareholders. They're communicating with their brokerage firms. And the SEC has said one of the things that we'd like to see at a blockchain is more transparency. So that way these public companies can actually identify and recognize who their shareholders are. And they want to see more of that relationship, a shareholder and company, as opposed to just an anonymous beneficial holder sitting in some brokerage account offshore.
Right. And the blockchain makes a lot of these things possible. It's really, I think, just a matter of time and effort and having people working with the regulators and sort of helping to massage how some of these things are going to play out, because we're going to continue to lose really good companies to trading markets that aren't as liquid, but Switzerland is active, Japan is active, Germany is pretty active.
I spoke with somebody in Scotland,
Uh-huh.
who you probably spoke to as well. You know, they're building up their technologies.
Australia, too.
Yeah. Yes, I have a
But,
client in
yeah,
Australia
Scotland
who's
is
doing,
pretty
yeah.
cool. But it's just, enough people from here are going to, and I'm talking about the regulators, the IRS, government officials, who are going to save too much money going out of the
Listen,
country.
the IRS still hasn't put out any official word, if I'm not mistaken, on Bitcoin and, you know, how they're going to tax that, so they're way behind.
It's starting to-
Did you have a question?
So when you look at if the UICOs, what's to stop when the US investor buys that and
So then you're dealing with jurisdictional issues, you know, they're supposed to keep it outside, and some people who are programming these smart contracts are programming it, so if you have a US identifier, you can't get whitelisted for the securities. Other people just don't care. You know, and the question is whether the SEC has jurisdiction if they're not directing sales at US
If there are no US
investors.
investors.
You know, well, he's saying if a US investor buys an overseas offering, you know, that's a whole separate
That's
question.
true. If you wind up with a lot of investors, then suddenly the SEC there. So I think we're getting hooked. I thought I saw the big gold coming out from behind the wall. Unless we have one more.
One more question.
Thank you. My question is about when markets open up, boards open up securities, T0, open finance, like that, do you think the SEC will treat that as a public company at that point?
Absolutely. I mean, T0, if I'm not mistaken, got the most subpoenas out of everybody. I mean, they're being very careful and very compliant. You know, they're going to, at some point, I don't know how many shareholders, if I'm not mistaken, they have under 2,000 shareholders now. At some point, when there's going to be an exchange, a marketplace, they're going to be viewed, if there's a market trading and things like that, they're going to be viewed as any other publicly traded company. You know, absolutely.
So stay tuned.
All right.